Today we start Unit 5, which is on the French Revolution and Napoleon. So today we're going to be talking about the French Revolution, and we'll finish up this topic next class. But before we start, think about the last thing we talked about in Unit 4. We talked about the American Revolution and how successful it was, and then the founding of our country. And the first thing we're going to talk about this unit is the French Revolution, which started shortly after the American Revolution ended. If you look at the years there, the American Revolution was 1775 through 83, and the French Revolution was 1789 through 99. All right, so they both took place in the late 18th century, but the French Revolution was inspired by the American Revolution, which happened first. So the ways that the American Revolution led to the French Revolution, well, in the 1780s, the French people were very inspired by what they saw happening in America, the way that Americans were able to break free from the oppressive rule of the English and really make a country for themselves with more rights and more freedoms for the people. And so the French wanted that for themselves. The French people, even though they didn't live in a colony, felt oppressed by their own king and wanted to break free from that system and wanted to accomplish what the Americans did. So they wanted a revolution of their own in order to replace their monarchy, which they perceived as authoritarian, which means having total power and oppressing their people. And they wanted to have a freer society, much like the United States. So the U.S. was the model upon which the revolutionaries tried to rebuild France. Now, I emphasize tried. Okay, they tried to rebuild France in the way that America was born, but it was not much of a success. The French Revolution is very different from the American Revolution, which is why I teach them in different units. The American Revolution is seen throughout history as a very good thing. Even if you ask modern British people, they'll say, yeah, it accomplished a lot. It did a lot of good for mankind, and yeah, of course, while no one likes to see their country lose, even British people say, yes, the American Revolution was a good thing, and no matter what country you're from, no matter what your political persuasion is, everyone can see the accomplishments and the benefits of the American Revolution. The French Revolution, however, is seen as just a bloody, chaotic mess that essentially accomplished nothing in the end. We'll see this come full circle throughout this unit, but they basically replaced one king for another king who didn't call himself a king. Remember, kind of like the English Civil War didn't really accomplish anything? The French Revolution was similar, and it left a path of blood in its wake. So in the end, the French overthrew an authoritarian monarchy of King Louis XVI, who we're about to talk about, and they eventually placed it with another authoritarian regime, killing thousands of people along the way. It didn't really accomplish anything. However, the ideas of the French Revolution, the ideas that the French Revolution brought about and brought to the table and created, those ideas really changed human history. There's going to be a document we're going to talk about called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. That was an important document. Even though it didn't work too well for France, it still impacted the course of history in some positive ways. All right, so the French Revolution itself did not really accomplish anything for France, but their ideas changed human history. So before we get into the events of the revolution, let's talk about what led up to it. Well, if you look at that political cartoon on the screen there, we haven't looked at a lot of political cartoons in this class, but around this time is when political cartoons started to get really clever and really insightful. And as you see here, this political cartoon features three people, and they represent the three classes of people in France. All right, so the guy on the top left, that is King Louis XVI, who we'll be talking about. He was the king of France at this time. And then to the right, you have the nobility. And then they are both on the back of a peasant. So in this political cartoon, it's basically saying that the wealthy are breaking the backs of the rich, breaking the backs of the poor, who represent most of the population. All right, so very famous political cartoon at the time, and it really represents how in the 1700s this was happening in France. The wealthy were kind of oppressing the poor, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. But in the 1700s, France was a wealthy and stable society throughout most of the century, but its tax structure was very problematic. It taxed pretty much only the poor, which doesn't really make sense. You should, tax people pretty equally, right? So really, only the peasants and the middle class were taxed at all, while the nobility and the clergy and the royalty, they didn't pay any taxes at all. The people who actually had plenty of money to pay taxes were not paying any. So it was seen as very unfair and was crippling for the people who were living in poverty. And then came an economic downturn in the 1780s. And there are a couple of reasons why this economic depression happened in France. First is because France became very deeply in debt because of, guess what? A war. Now, this time they became in debt because of helping the Americans in the American Revolution. Remember, they helped us out tremendously. One of the big reasons why we won. But their helping us out came with a price. Okay? They had to spend a lot of money helping out the American colonists during the American Revolution, and that debt caused an economic downturn in France in the 1780s. Also, King Louis XVI, okay, the king at this time, the grandson of King Louis XIV, who we've learned about, Louis XVI started to spend about half of France's federal budget to pay off the national debt. Now, paying off the national debt's a good thing. I mean, we could definitely use that here in America. But half, half of France's national budget just used to pay off the debt. I mean, not to mention all the other things it had to pay for. So his attempted financial reforms really failed, and this caused France to have to declare bankruptcy. They were completely broke by the mid-1780s. Now, at the same time, as bad luck would have it, a ton of hailstorms occurred in France, and that really damages farmland, and it's decreased the food supply in France, which led to widespread hunger. So you have high taxes, you have widespread hunger, you have a national debt that's out of control, you have France declaring bankruptcy. Not good times for the French. And by 1789, French peasants were becoming really frustrated, very angry, to the point of rebellion. And you can understand why. I mean, they were suffering tremendously at the hands of, well, just circumstance for one, but also King Louis's unintelligent policies and unfair tax system. So really simple equation I use here: high taxes plus widespread hunger equals angry peasants. 100% of the time, you're going to have angry peasants if you have high taxes combined with widespread hunger, not something you want to aim for. Now, meanwhile, while the 97% of the population that were peasants, while they were starving, basically, King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette, they were not suffering at all. They were dining very well. They were living in luxury at the Palace of Versailles that Louis XIV had built. And the nobles weren't really suffering either. So this also made peasants want to rebel, saying, well, if these classes can live without suffering, well, maybe if they would help us out a little bit, they would alleviate some of our suffering. So that made them really angry and made them want to rebel, which eventually is what happened. But while this was all brewing, while the French peasants were becoming very agitated, very frustrated, Louis XVI said, okay, we have to do something here. We need to respond to this food crisis and this crisis of confidence in our country. So we called a meeting of the Estates General. So an Estates General, that was a group made up of representatives from all three estates. So kind of like Congress or Parliament, but this made sure to have plenty of representatives from the peasant class as well as the upper classes. And the results of this meeting is that they failed to agree on anything at all. They could not agree on anything. The representatives of the third estate, the peasants, wanted one thing and everyone else wanted something else. So the representatives of the third estate, the peasant representatives, they left the meeting in frustration because they said, we're not getting anything done here. Our voices are not being heard. So they left and actually started their own legislative body, and they called it the National Assembly. So the Estates General broke apart, and the third estate formed the National Assembly. King Louis XVI did not take this kindly. He thought this was very disrespectful, an act of insubordination, and so he locked them out of the building. He said, hey, if you want to meet somewhere, good luck finding a place because you can't come into this building. And he locked them out and continued meeting with the other estates in the Estates General. This caused the Third Estate to have to meet at an indoor tennis court. So this is where the National Assembly first met. It was at an indoor tennis court, kind of like a YMCA, I guess. And here they swore something called the tennis court oath. Go ahead and underline that phrase. You will need to know that for the test, the tennis court oath. And in this oath, they vowed that they would create a French constitution. A French constitution. Remember, this is right after America has created their own constitution. And so the French said, hey, we want a constitution like America. We want to gain the rights and freedoms that the Americans have done. We want to be like them. So as you see, very much inspired by the revolution that had just occurred across the ocean. The event that officially started what we know of as the French Revolution were essentially uprisings over food shortages. There were a lot of uprisings that began over food shortages in the country. Peasants kind of protesting in the streets, saying we need food, all right, stop living in luxury while we starve, do something about it. And in order to calm this down, King Louis XVI sent troops to Paris to break up all of these riots that were happening because the people were starving. Now, the peasants said, are you kidding me? You're sending your troops to calm down your own people? They really saw this as an act of war. You know, how could you send our own troops on us? And the people responded to this, what they interpreted as an act of war, by storming the Bastille prison. The Bastille prison was this massive, terrible prison with torture chambers and very poor condition for prisoners. And they invaded the Bastille prison, killed the guards, and set free the prisoners into the streets. And you can understand how chaotic and bloody that would be. Okay, so this is already starting as a bloody, chaotic mess, and you'll see this circle keeps going and going until it's clear they accomplished nothing. But starting out, they thought they were going to accomplish something, good was going to come from it, and this was on July 14th, 1789, the official beginning of the French Revolution. And still in France today, every July 14th, they celebrate Bastille Day. Kind of like the U.S. celebrates the 4th of July, Independence Day, they celebrate Bastille Day still every year. So this was done in order to both free peasant prisoners, but it was also done in order to acquire guns and ammunition from the soldiers that they killed or assaulted. And the peasants did just that. They acquired guns and ammo while at the same time freeing prisoners. Okay. Later on that summer, the National Assembly met again, and they published a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Okay, this was supposed to be kind of like the United States' Declaration of Independence combined with the Constitution, or certainly the Bill of Rights, kind of combined a lot of those ideas, okay, a lot of Enlightenment ideas in this, and this proclaimed that everyone had certain natural rights. We've heard that before. We've heard that from John Locke. Remember, John Locke said everyone has the natural right to life, liberty, and property. Later on, Thomas Jefferson changed that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And here, with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the French National Assembly said everyone has the natural right to life, liberty, and security. All right, so they changed that phrase slightly once again. All right, and they made securing these rights integral to their new constitution. Now, when it began, this revolution, people expected it to result in a change in France. Obviously, most revolutions do lead to some sort of a change. But at the beginning, it looked like France was going to become a constitutional monarchy, which basically is a blend between democracy and monarchy, where you have a constitution, you have like a parliament, but you still have a king or a queen. For example, England has a constitutional monarchy. They have the monarch, and then they also have parliament. That is what people thought was going to happen in France, which would have meant that Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette would still be king and queen of France, but they would just give up some of their power. There would be a parliament, kind of like Congress, as well. Okay, so if you were the king or queen, certainly you wouldn't like that, but at the same time, it's not the worst thing in the world. You'd still get to keep your title and some of your power. But then, in October of 1789, a rumor started in Paris that Marie Antoinette was actually hoarding grain somewhere inside the Versailles Palace where she and Louis lived. Now, this rumor, as far as I know, was not true. It wasn't really corroborated, but people believed it because they wanted to believe it. They wanted to believe there was a bad guy, a real reason why they were starving. So this led to something called the Women's March. Okay, the Women's March. This was a violent protest in which a large group of very angry peasant women stormed the Palace of Versailles and demanded that Louis and Marie be kicked out and moved to Paris. All right, this is just an insane event. I mean, can you imagine like the White House being invaded by the people? It wouldn't happen nowadays, at least not in a country like America. So their palace was invaded, and they were forced to leave the palace, leave their life of luxury, so that the peasants could have it. So dozens of their guards were actually killed during the Women's March by these women. You had a certain group of women that were called fish ladies. They would work in the market. They would butcher fish and sell fish, and so their hands were really callous and they had big muscles, and people called them the fish ladies. And so of course they were effective as fighters here. And the king and the queen were moved to Paris reluctantly, essentially as prisoners. All right, so you pretty much have the king and queen being prisoners at this point. And now people are starting to think, oh, maybe this won't result in a simple constitutional monarchy change. Maybe this is going to be even bigger than that. And then came along a group of people called the Jacobins. The Jacobins, very important group to know about. They were a radical, violent wing of revolutionaries. They said peaceful protest is not the way to go. We need to keep pushing the boundaries, keep killing people, keep enacting violence, because that is the only way to bring about real change. And they actually called for the creation of a republic instead of simply a constitutional monarchy. They said, we don't want a monarchy at all, even if it's a constitutional monarchy. We don't want a king. We don't want a queen. We want a president like America has. All right. They wanted to entirely remove the king and queen from the equation and have a constitutional republic. So these Jacobins, they held a protest march and were actually fired upon by troops of the National Assembly, and 50 of them were killed. Now remember, the National Assembly is pro-revolution. They were some of the ones who started the revolution. They're mostly peasants, so they support most forms of the revolution. But the Jacobins were even too radical for them, too radical for the revolutionaries. Okay, that is how radical and violent the Jacobins were, and in response, 50 of them were killed. So fast forward about 2 years here, okay, 1791, the Assembly completed a new constitution for France, right? The first constitution is gone, and now they make another constitution, all right? Throughout the revolution, you'll see the constitution changes again and again and again. They keep getting new constitutions. So remember last class when we talked about the American Constitution, how special it is that it has survived for over 200 years, and it's still our governing document. France kind of proves that they've been through so many constitutions in the past 200 years. So this new constitution, which King Louis reluctantly approved, created a limited constitutional monarchy. It stripped the king of a lot of his authority, but let him keep his symbolic power and his title as the head of state. And it also created the Legislative Assembly. Okay, the Legislative Assembly, kind of like the U.S. Congress. Okay, you're allowed to make laws and declare war. But this new French government was also seen as a failure. Okay? Constitution Take Two was seen as a weak document as well, because despite having a new government, old problems still existed. Okay, there were still food shortages in France. Okay, peasants still didn't have enough food to eat. There was still a lot of debt that didn't go away. You don't solve these problems just by instantly getting new leadership. That doesn't really change anything. So these problems still existed. And the newly created Legislative Assembly disagreed on how exactly to fix these problems. They couldn't decide, should we keep this limited monarchy? Should we remove the king entirely and establish a republic like the Jacobins want to do? Should we undo this revolution, say, hey, this whole thing was a mistake? Maybe we should restore the absolute monarchy, because things were at least a little more stable when King Louis was the absolute ruler. So the Legislative Assembly kept debating, could not decide what to do. They were very indecisive. And this confusion and division really caused more violence to erupt on the streets of Paris. People are like, are you kidding me? You can't even make a decision. This is our lives. People are dying from starvation and malnutrition. We need to fix these problems, right? So it was a very, very violent time, especially in Paris. Then in 1792, this chaos was added to, all right? You have troops from Prussia and Austria trying to invade Paris. And the reason why they would do that is because Paris is obviously in a weakened state at this point, all right? They have a revolution going on. Their king has kind of been deposed, limited in power. They have this new constitution, these new governing bodies, and Prussia and Austria say, hey, they are very weak right now. let's kick them while they're down. This is a perfect opportunity to capitalize on this and invade France. So that's exactly what they did. Now, this ultimately failed. The Prussians and Austrians were not ultimately able to take territory from France. However, Louis XVI kind of encouraged them. He was kind of hoping that the Prussians and Austrians would succeed in fighting his country, because if he did, he was kind of hoping that the Prussians and the Austrians would reappoint him as king of that area. Now, whenever the French people heard that he was secretly rooting for the Prussians and Austrians, they saw this not only as abandonment and betrayal, but as treason. And you know what the punishment for treason was: death. So in response to pressure from restless peasants in the streets, the Legislative Assembly was completely dissolved. Okay, new constitution, okay, new forms of government, and the king was deposed, and the monarchy was replaced with a republic. All right, so we went from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, and now we have a republic with a new constitution. And then, remember that violent fringe wing of the revolutionaries, the Jacobins? They actually took control of the government here. The Jacobins took control of the National Convention, which was the new governing body. First you had the National Assembly, then the Legislative Assembly, and now you have something called the National Convention, controlled by the Jacobins, and they called for the death of all of those who continued to support Louis XVI. Okay, now think about this. France has had a king since ever since back in the time of Charlemagne, okay, over 1,000 years, France has had a king. And now the Jacobins make this republic, depose the king, and said, hey, you better not have any warm, fuzzy feelings about the king, or else we're going to kill you. You can understand how, as a French person, that's kind of in your blood. Kind of like as Americans, we like the idea of having a president, whether or not we like a specific president who might be in power. So very radical approach to kill people who supported the king in any way. And of course, with King Louis' supporters being killed, you got to probably see this coming, what's coming next, and that is the death of King Louis himself. So Louis was imprisoned for his support of the Prussians during the war, which is kind of understandable. Okay, you understand the revolutionaries there. I mean, he shouldn't support a country that's not his own just so he can be reinstated. But once the Jacobins took control of the French Republic, they imprisoned King Louis. He was then put on trial. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death via guillotine. Okay, the guillotine was an execution device, okay, created around this time and place, and it was advertised as humane and egalitarian. So there's a picture of the guillotine on the screen there, and you see there's a blade, okay, and you put your head in that hole there. Your body's laid down, and then the blade goes down and chops off your head, and your head falls into a basket. So it's seen as humane because it was quick, and as far as we know, it was painless. And even if it wasn't completely painless, way less painful than being burned at the stake. All right. So it was advertised as humane, which was an Enlightenment principle that you should kill people painlessly and quickly if you kill them. And it was also egalitarian, meaning everybody dies the same way, whether you're royalty, whether you're a peasant, whether you're nobility or clergy, everyone dies the same way. Egalitarian means total equality, basically, not favoring one group over another. So on January 21st, 1793, King Louis XVI was beheaded. Okay, the death of the king. The Jacobins believed that the only way to kill the monarchy was through the death of a monarch. Here's a drawing of the execution of King Louis XVI that was drawn and put in the French newspapers. All right, so his head was kind of paraded throughout town, as you see in that picture there. Now, the Jacobins had many enemies. Yes, they did have a lot of power at this time, but they also had a lot of enemies. Namely, pretty much every other country in Europe was appalled at what the Jacobins were doing. Okay, they couldn't believe the kind of things that the Jacobins believed in and actually brought to fruition. That the fact that you would actually kill your king, not only would you depose him, but you would behead him. I mean, that was unthinkable. The royalty never got the death sentence, hardly ever. And here they did, all right? So most countries in Europe were completely disgusted with the Jacobins. Also, a lot of French peasants were horrified too, because even though they didn't really like the king so much and didn't like what he was doing, with his economic policies and so on, they were still horrified that he was executed. Again, that the death of a king was almost unheard of in France. Also, a lot of French priests did not like the Jacobins because their government was secular. Remember, the word secular means non-religious. Very religious people at this time said the government should be religious. We should have either a monarchy or something to where it is a religious form of government. And there were also a lot of people within France who wanted to take the government away from the Jacobins. And then came along this guy named Maximilien Robespierre. This is the last person we're going to talk about today, and we'll pick up here next class. But Maximilien Robespierre played a very important, very brutal role in the French Revolution. Okay? In 1793, he gained power, and he was a Jacobin. He became the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, which they called it, which is kind of a misnomer because they did nothing to protect the safety of the public. But as the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, Robespierre, he set to rebuild a republic of virtue, he said. And the only way, he said, we could build a republic of virtue was by wiping out every trace of France's past. He said, we do not want our past to influence us at all. We need to completely remake France, which means to get rid of all of our past traditions, including French religion, which was Catholicism, all right? So he got rid of religion, not just in the government, but in culture as well. He said we should not be religious, should not be Christian, we should be completely secular. He also changed the calendar. He changed the calendar. So instead of being the year 1793, he made it the year 4, because he said the year 1 was the year our revolution began in 1789, and we should keep the years going in that way because this is really the beginning of all things. He didn't want the calendar to be based on the birth of Christ because he said religion and Christianity was bad. He also renamed every month and removed all Sundays. The reason why he removed Sundays from the calendar was because he didn't want people to know when was the day they used to go to church. Okay, so you might think, could he do that? Well, yeah, technically. I mean, if he's the ruler of the country, I mean, a calendar is pretty arbitrary. It was created by humans, so it can be taken away by humans too. But everywhere else in the world still had, the same calendar, except for in France, because under Robespierre, he said, nope, their calendars are wrong. There are no such things as Sundays. All the months have different names, and we don't have any religious holidays anymore. He closed all churches in France, and he made religion illegal. Okay, so you see this French Revolution becoming more and more and more radical. At first, it was just, okay, we need reforms. Then it was, all right, let's try a constitutional monarchy. Then it was, let's have a republic. Now it's a Jacobin-led republic. And now they're saying do away with all religion and all tradition. Okay, so you can see how crazy it has gotten. And for 1 year, one horrible, bloody year, Robespierre governed France as a dictator. Okay, from 1793 to 1794, he was the dictator of France, and his rule was known as the Reign of Terror because so many people were slaughtered in France under Robespierre. And we'll get into the specifics of the Reign of Terror and talk about how this French Revolution came to an end next class.